Today, we have 8 terrifying stories told from the perspective of police officers. So, without further ado, let's get on with the video. I'm your host, Severed Soul. Over 20 years ago, I took an alarm call from the old PTA building across the street from a courthouse in Austin, Texas. The alarm had already gone quiet when I showed up with a senior officer. We found an unsecured door slightly open on the east side, so he posted me there while he finished the perimeter and we waited for other officers to arrive. I was staring right at the door when the alarm activated again and the door slammed shut right in my face. The senior officer ran straight back to my position and asked me why I'd closed the door, which of course I told him I hadn't. We called for K9 and the dog arrived shortly after. I went in with K9 to clear the building. We found nothing, but the entire time we were in there, the dog was acting really skittish. Like he knew someone was in the building, but he wasn't picking up a scent. We secured the building, and the key holder showed up soon after. He said, "Well, you know this building is haunted, right?" There was a secretary who had worked there for about 30 years, but after she died, she kept showing up for work. Papers would fly off the desks. Doors would open and close on their own. Some staff members even claimed to have seen her. We both told the key holder, next time there was an alarm call, it was all his. My partner and I were called to a college that is reported to be haunted. We didn't believe any of it. At around 2 AM, we walked into Clark Hall and started propping doors open with desks. We already walked through and made sure the building was empty. There was only 2 stairwells, so this wasn't difficult to do. We were on the 3rd floor. I'd just finished checking a room and wedged the desk between the door and the frame, shaking it to make sure it was secure. I walked over to help my buddy with his door when I heard a loud noise from behind me. The chair-desk combo slid right across the floor and the door that I was working on slammed shut. Without saying a word, my partner took off, sprinting, jumping, landing to landing. I still don't think he's ever been back in that building since. I answered a welfare check call late one night. It was between 2:30 and 3 AM. An elderly woman who lived next door to the caller hadn't been seen for quite some time. This night, we were having a bad thunderstorm without the rain. I arrived at the complainant's house to speak to her first, wondering why she'd called at this time. She told me that the lady next door was in her 90s. She lived alone and she hadn't been seen for a number of weeks. She explained that she'd called her and been round and knocked on the door, but the lady just won't answer. I was quietly presuming that the lady was deceased, and probably had been for some time. The car outside the property had a 3-inch thick layer of dust on it. The mail was piling up, and there were no lights on inside the house. First, I walked to the side door and knocked on the door with my flashlight. I knocked just loud enough that an elderly person with limited hearing should be able to hear. After a few minutes of no response, I turned and walked to the rear of the house. I had a glance at the windows, and everything seemed to be okay. The complainant was with me, and she was saying that she didn't know of any relatives of the old lady. I was pretty sure by this point that the old lady was probably deceased. I walked back around to the front of the house and noticed that the blinds were up on the front windows, and to my surprise, I could see a glow coming from inside the house. I was, however, not tall enough to look inside the windows, which were probably 7 feet off the ground. The complainant ran back next door and obtained a metal bucket for me to stand on. I stood on the bucket, and bingo, I could see into the living room. The glow was coming from the TV, which was on a blue screen, and was bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight. First of all, I looked at the floor just to check that she hadn't fallen down there. The couch, the recliner, everything was clear. But the telephone home base was blinking red from missed calls and voicemails. Clearly the phone hadn't been answered for some time. From the living room was a hallway, which was just too dark for me to see down. Using my flashlight, I could only see an open door down the hall, but still no signs of life. I turned around and told the complainant that everything looked okay and nothing seemed to be disturbed. What happened next was absolutely horrifying. As I turned back around to look into the window, there was now an elderly lady standing with her face pressed right up against the glass, staring at me. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I'd been hit straight in the chest with a bat. I fell backwards off the bucket and hit the ground pretty hard. The complainant rushed to assist me. I shrugged her off as she was trying to help me and quickly got back to my feet to stand back on that bucket. I needed to get another look inside that window. My heart was absolutely pounding. Instinctively, I had one hand on my gun, while the other was pressed up against the window. I looked back inside and saw a frail, elderly lady standing in the hallway with her back to me, wearing a long nightgown. She turned her head to the side and looked at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she slowly walked down the dark hallway. This really unnerved me. I got down and looked at the complainant, who was standing there with a puzzled look on her face. All I could say to her was that I'd seen the old lady. By this time, the wind had really picked up and it had started to rain. I started to walk back to my car by the road, and I turned to face the complainant. I said to her, if I was you, I'd leave this house well alone. I got back into the car and drove to the police station. I never found out about the old lady that lived there. The complainant never called back, and the house now has different tenants inside. Some things are better off left alone. Several years ago, I took a 911 call from a family claiming that their daughter had been possessed. The family claimed that there was absolutely no possibility that drugs were involved, and there was no history of any mental health issues, which, of course, I didn't believe for 1 second. Family members were holding the girl down, and from the other end of the phone I could clearly hear 2 people screaming at each other in the background. I asked the caller to tell whoever was yelling at the girl in the background to stop. The caller said, "It's her." I said, "I know it's her, but whoever's yelling at her, you need to tell them to stop." Again, the caller said, "It's her." Both voices. I kid you not, this was the creepiest thing I had ever heard. I've been doing this job for 25 years, and I've heard many things. I know all too well of man's inhumanity and the terrible things people do to each other. But this was a different kind of evil. I was very clearly hearing a young girl screaming and an adult male voice yelling back at her. I couldn't understand either language, but they were definitely 2 different voices. The family claimed that both voices were coming from the girl at the same time. It really made my skin crawl. Later on, the lieutenant listened to the tape and turned to me and said, "Do you ever wonder?" Yes, I do. I've seen a lot of things in my career, things that would make a citizen doubt my sanity. From being dispatched to chase a UFO, to reported sightings of ghosts. But the strangest thing that ever happened was witnessed by several other officers and a member of the dispatch team. One evening, I brought a guy in for domestic violence, and as he was a bit rowdy, I was joined by the sergeant and a member of the patrol team. I was in the process of booking in Mr. Tough Guy when I glanced over into cell number 1. There was a guy in there, with a short haircut, glasses, and a white t-shirt, just standing there staring at us. I ignored him because I didn't want him to start banging on the window, demanding a phone call or something. So, I finished the booking process and escorted Mr. Tough Guy to his cell, walking past cell number 1. The guy in the cell was still standing there staring at us, silent and motionless. We all then leave booking and go about our business. Sometime later, the sergeant asked me to check the paperwork for the prisoners to see if anybody was ready to be transported to county jail. I grabbed the paperwork and went back into booking to do a head count. To my shock, cell number 1 was now completely empty. Understandably, I panicked and told the sergeant, who also started to panic. We both started making phone calls to the officers to see if anybody had moved the guy or released him. They all said they hadn't been into booking at all. I then checked the computer system and the paperwork again, and the head count was accurate. Nobody had ever been placed in cell number 1. We went to the dispatch office to check the surveillance video for booking. We rewound the footage to where I can be seen booking my prisoner in. Then, we fast forward to the point in the video where we all walked out. As soon as we walked past the door, the guy in cell number 1 completely disappeared. We were all freaked out by the occurrence, believe you me. When we tried to transfer the video to a DVD and USB drive, the guy in cell number 1 was nowhere to be seen. We all see and hear things every now and then, and sometimes prisoners in the detox tank can be seen talking to somebody in the direction of cell number 1, even though it appears to be empty. To this day, I'm wary of going into booking alone. I was called to a burglary process in the middle of the afternoon. The owner of the house was in the kitchen and heard footsteps running up to the 3rd floor. It was a very old house with wooden stairs. We arrived and set up a perimeter around the house. K9 arrived soon after, and just as I was talking to the handler, a perimeter officer claimed to have seen a hand from the window on the 3rd floor pull back the curtain. With the perimeter secure, K9 entered the house and made their way up to the 3rd floor. After an extensive search, nobody was found. The officer was absolutely 100% certain that he'd seen what he'd seen, and the homeowner was completely adamant that he had heard the sound of boots running up the stairs to the 3rd floor. I was the sergeant, working an overtime graveyard shift at a now demolished sub. I was on my lunch break when I heard a door open at the other end of the sub, followed by the sound of footsteps. I had the light off in my office because the hallway lights were more than sufficient. From my peripheral, I could see someone standing at the door, and when I turned to look, there was a shadow figure standing in the doorway as if to say hello. This wasn't something I'd seen out of the corner of my eye. I clearly saw it standing there for a few seconds before it turned away and walked down the hallway towards the lieutenant's office. Later, when I asked the guys if they'd ever experienced anything strange at the hub, they laughed and said, "That's exactly why we don't come back to the sub until the sun comes up." I found out that there's been many similar experiences to mine at the sub. I'm still a skeptic. I just have no explanation for what I saw. A couple of years back, I was patrolling at around 3 to 4 AM. I drove past a small airport that's in my jurisdiction that's in the middle of the woods. It has several hangars and one main office building. I drove past it a few times every night, as it's been burglarised in the past. On this particular night, I was driving past when I heard an alarm sound audible from inside the office. It wasn't dispatched, and I didn't receive any other calls about it. I called it in and walked up to the office, which was completely dark and unoccupied. Every point of entry was secure, so I was now waiting on the key holder to arrive and let me in. I entered the office to clear the inside, and figured maybe a loose door or something in the wind had tripped the alarm. The key holder and his wife walked through the office with me and confirmed that nothing had been disturbed. But the key holder was confused, because the alarm system wasn't a motion sensor alarm. The key holder explained to me that the alarm we were hearing was coming from a cash register inside the office. The cash register had been opened, but it could only be opened by pressing a button. Without going into too much detail, this button was extremely well hidden. The only people that knew where the button was the key holder himself, his wife, and his father, who was deceased. He told me that the cash register closes and locks without pressing the button. It couldn't possibly open. This wasn't an oversight either. I'd driven past the office earlier in the night and didn't hear an alarm. No money had been taken. The cash was undisturbed, but the drawer to the register was all the way open. The key holder smiled and told me that his father had built and owned the airport before he passed away. He continued that airplanes, and this place in particular, were his father's passion and life's work. He then went on to tell me that it's his belief that his father does things like this to bring his family to the airport, just to say hello and make his presence known. I don't have any other explanation for it. That wraps things up for today. I really hope those stories give you nightmares. If you enjoyed the video, please show some support by liking and subscribing to the channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. Leave your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.